From WFIU in Bloomington, Indiana, I'm Kate Young, and this is Earth Eats.
There's a beautiful Hindustani saying which says, Kosa par pani badle, chare par vani, which means every 2 miles the water changes, every 4 the language. So that, in fact, is the geography of taste and terroir in India.
This week on the show, we talk with sociologist Krishnendu Ray about place and food and caste in India and how identity can be defined as much by what you don't eat as by what you do eat. And we share a recipe for a homegrown hot sauce that cannot be prepared indoors. That's all just ahead. Stay with us. Thanks for listening to Earth Eats. I'm Kate Young. Do you eat with a fork or your hands or chopsticks? Do you eat pork? Do you eat beef? Are you a vegetarian? How does what you eat and how you eat connect to your worldview, to the way you move through the world, or in some cases, even your safety? We explore these questions and more in our conversation with Krishnendu Ray.
Hi, Kate. I'm Krishnendu Ray, and I'm a professor of nutrition at food studies at New York University. And my work tends to be on immigrants and foodways, what changes, what stays the same, what difference does it make to the immigrants themselves, and what difference it makes to other Americans. I come from sociology, and the part of the world I come from, which is India, and because I'm here to present a talk at the Dhar program of Indian studies. In India, there's not that much of a difference between sociology, cultural sociology, and cultural anthropology, but a lot of my work is anthropological, but I'm trained as a sociologist, so as a cultural sociologist. And I'm part of a department that's called Nutrition and Food Studies. It's an unusual department because usually a nutrition department has nutritional science and would typically have food science. But by calling something nutrition and food studies, that studies is hinting towards social sciences and the humanities. And that was part of the imagination of founding chair of the program of the department. Her name is Marion Nessel, and she's a bit of a celebrity.
Yeah.
She wrote a book called Food Politics,
Yeah.
and she's written dozens of books. When she was kind of reconfiguring the department, she had a pretty good idea about what we know about nutritional science and what we don't know. But she said the big gap was understanding the social context of eating. Why do people eat certain things, not eat certain things, love certain things? I'll give you an example. At what point did Americans say, we are a meat and potatoes culture, but we love sushi? No one could have predicted that.
Right.
How did that change happen? Okay, so she was interested in bringing in some of the social questions. So she hired a historian, Amy Bentley, first. Then they hired someone like me coming out of sociology. And I had gotten my PhD from SUNY Binghamton and had taught for a decade at the Culinary Institute of America, where that itself was a fascinating transition. Because the Culinary Institute of America hired me as one of the earliest people working on a PhD because they wanted to expand the curriculum. Their argument, the president and the vice president's argument, was that we know what it takes to train a great chef and a sommelier and a baker, but in today's world, a chef is in fact becoming more like a public intellectual.
Wow.
So the chef needs to know about cultural difference, about sustainability, about health and public health. So I was one of the people they hired to say, could you start the curriculum on food and cultures of Asia, food and cultures of the Americas, and food and cultures of Europe? And so in some ways, my sociological training and my kind of an anthropological orientation shaped the curriculum at the Culinary Institute of America. This is happening mostly in the 1990s.
Yeah, that is super interesting. I saw that you had been there and I was like, okay, that's unexpected. So yeah, thank you for explaining that.
That's an unusual trajectory. Usually a scholar doesn't go to the culinary school and then return back, in my case, to NYU. Okay. And I think in some ways the Culinary Institute was beginning at itself, a bit like, think about a music school, like say Juilliard. So you will have musicians, but you will also have ethnomusicologists. And that's the kind of role I was hired in, to be, in some ways, an ethnographer and a social historian and primarily a sociologist of food and food professions and food cultures.
And the chefs are the ones who are practicing.
Exactly. Yeah. Practicing the art, practicing the craft. They also needed a space to think about bigger, broader issues. Okay, and in this case, for instance, what have immigrants contributed to American styles of eating? Okay, for instance, we know from research that, for instance, it is the Italian immigrants who taught most Americans how to eat salad, how to eat bitter greens. They came from Italy, especially southern Italy, where it's a kind of a routine part of everyday eating, and that became part of, say, I come from New York. I'm now in New York City. In New York City, the greengrocers were all Italian and selling the broccoli rabe and the salad greens that the rest of us are going to get to almost 20, 40 years later.
Wow.
And so in some ways, it's very interesting how each group of immigrants have taught us new things to eat. Like right now, with Mexican migration, we are learning to eat avocados. We have learned to eat avocados. Everyone has avocado on their toast now, and also various kinds of chilies, green chilies, smoked chilies. And so that's the new migration that is reshaping the American palate through, say, making a guacamole.
So you are on the campus of Indiana University to give a talk with a pretty provocative title, I think, Indian Food at Home and Abroad, Discriminating Tastes, Borrowed Palates, and Ethnocentric Violence. So could you tell us more about your talk?
Yeah, that's a big title. So just to give you a sense, India is a place with almost 1.5 billion people. That is larger than Europe. India is a place with more than 270 mother tongues, more than 20,000 dialects. Okay, so the first argument is nations do not match to one cuisine. So in some ways, Indian food is an abstraction that you can only see from very far away. It's like calling something European food. Yes, you can name something that unites, say, Polish pierogies to Sicilian pizza, but it'll be very unconvincing for an American audience, which has already been exposed to a Polish migration and a Sicilian migration, to understand these are totally different things. And India is, multiply that by 10 at least, and you see. So the first argument there is how to think of a thing called Indian food when you have 20,000 dialects. And my short answer to that question is, wherever there's a dialect, there's a cuisine. So I would say there are at least 20,000 Indian cuisines. And a dialect is a good way to think about it, because food is what goes in, language is what comes out. Food is very subjective. I don't know how you exactly taste vanilla or you taste chocolate. I know what I taste. I can only begin to approximate towards whether you like vanilla, prefer vanilla over chocolate, what chocolate tastes, do you like more bitter chocolates or the sweeter one, only by talking to you. So in fact, taste is totally subjective until we start talking about it, which is how it's linked to language. And that socializes it. That's what I mean by taste and talk are two sides of the same process. And maybe I'll finish with, there's a beautiful Hindustani saying which goes like this, which says, Kosa par pani badle, chare Kosa par vani, which means every 2 miles the water changes, every 4 the language. So that, in fact, is the geography of taste and terroir in India. And that is what I'm saying when I'm saying I associate Indian food with at least 20,000 cuisines. So that's my first claim.
Okay. And then what next? Discriminating tastes, borrowed palates, and ethnocentric violence.
Okay, so my first argument is multiplicity and variety of India, and I associate that with language. In India, like anywhere else, food is also an important tool of discrimination in a double sense. Discrimination in the first sense of discriminating taste. How do I know a dal? A dal is a legume lentil stew. And India is probably one of the regions in the world where you have dozens of legumes, stewed legumes, and they're a very important part of a cuisine. How do I discriminate, that is to distinguish one kind of legume from the other? I'll give you an example. I come originally in India from a small town called Balasore, which is the east coast of peninsular India. If you can imagine India in your head, it's like a rhombus. This is going back to your middle school, high school geometry, a rhombus and a large rhombus and a little rhombus. So I come from the eastern end of that rhombus, which is peninsular India, around the city of Kolkata, but in the state of Odisha. My mother tongue is Odia, and my father tongue is Bengali. Bengali is to Odia what Spanish is to Italian, but with a different script. Okay? So kind of this is the context in which you have this multiplicity and variety. And what that Hindustani saying is Kosa Kosa par pani badle, chare Kosa par vani, is in fact taste changes in different parts of India. And it is being able to distinguish and discriminate that taste. That's the first aspect of discriminating taste, making refined commentary and distinctions. Like my maternal grandmother would cook her pink dal, lentils, with, in some ways, some onions, some garlic, roasted garlic. So it had a very garlicky flavor. My paternal grandmother would cook it with a Bengali 5-spice called panchphoron. Panchphoron has fenugreek in it, fennel in it, mustard in it, So it'll have a slightly smoky flavor, okay, and different from the garlic onion flavor of my maternal grandmother. And they thought they were doing two very different things. And can I make the distinction between these two dals? That is about what? They lived about less than a kilometer apart from each other in this Odia town of Balasore in coastal India, and they thought they were doing two different things. For someone from outside, that might taste quite similar to each other. Okay, so one part of discriminating taste is being able to make fine judgments. The other part of discriminating taste is, in fact, discrimination, which is in India, a lot of the discrimination happens on histories of caste. Caste is a big and a complicated topic, and I would say caste is both ancient and modern. The caste, the term itself, is a Portuguese term, and we came to name it in particular ways. It is ancient in terms of ways of organizing a people, where different waves of people have come into India from northwestern India and settled in, and they often have married local women. That's why, by the way, in Indian history, father tongues and mother tongues are quite distinct. This anthropologist and linguist Peggy Mohan, in fact, is writing a book called Father Tongue and Motherland, which is this kind of a complicated and interesting relationship. But the way this relates to is different people were classified as different caste by these people coming into India and settling in, and created a hierarchy. These are not equal differences, but according to the standard theory, there are 4 castes of Brahmins at the top, which is a small percentage of the population, Kshatriya, the warrior caste, and then Vaishya, the trade, and Shudra, in some ways, the working castes. Okay. Then there was a 5th category, often given various names, who are called outcasts. Today, in Indian history, they often self-identify as Dalits. These are the same group of people who Gandhi, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, the great Indian nationalist leader, identified as Harijans, that is God's people. okay, as a way of getting past the discrimination in the naming. More activist Harijans have come to see themselves as, call themselves Dalits, and constitutionally in India they are called scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. And coming back to this question of discrimination, what has been central to at least 2,000 years, if not more, of Indian history is who you eat with and who you marry. Caste determines. Okay, so in some ways, in the Indian context, I would say, I think the analogy would be, in the West sometimes we say, and in India also, you are what you eat. But then there's the other side that's also very important. You are what you do not eat, and you are who you do not eat with. I think those are the two rules that determines caste. And I think that's probably a universal principle everywhere in the world. But in India, it came to be associated with upper caste vegetarianism. And in fact, most of people who eat, for instance, beef, can be part of the Hindu world, but they are often considered outcast. But in some parts of India, like in Kerala, even Hindus can eat beef because they live in close proximity to old Muslim populations. So anything you say about India, by the way, you have to qualify. And in some ways, it tend to be an overgeneralization. But what I'm going to talk about is the two dimensions of discriminating taste, which is ability to make fine judgments about what is good taste, and how that, in fact, is linked to questions of exclusion, hierarchy, and discrimination, which has been historically very important and continues to be important in India. There's a recent cookbook that came out in Maharashtra, one of the states, in one of the languages, Marathi, and it is about Dalit kitchens. Okay, it is written by Sahu Patole, and it is about how these communities, what they ate, and how their food was considered inferior by rest of Hindu upper caste. So that is also part of India's food history, and that's what I mean by discriminating tastes.
Really, really fascinating. And so I think the part that really got my attention was the ethnocentric violence. And is that about sort of contemporary India?
Two kinds of ethnocentric violence that are very disheartening in India. One is anti-Muslim violence. India has one of the largest Muslim populations in the world, but it's a minority population. It's analogously about the same as, say, the African-American population in the United States. But remember, if you take 12% of the population out of 1.5 billion, you get, in fact, a country with a very substantial Muslim population. What has unfortunately happened in India is physical violence, including lynching, killing of two kinds of people by Hindu mobs. And one, the target are Muslims, and the other target are often Dalits, the very people I talked about, who are the people, in fact, who dispose of dead animals and, in fact, consume what historically was carrion. It was not even butchered specifically, but carrion, an animal dies and the food is consumed by their lower caste. Because remember, in India, upper caste tend to be vegetarian. So that's a very interesting, peculiar inversion in terms of global regional histories. And in India, over the last 2 decades now, we have seen increasing violence on allegations and rumors of meat eating, specifically beef eating, largely targeted against Muslim populations and Dalit populations. And that has come to be identified strongly with Hindu nationalism and vegetarianism as kind of a force in Indian politics. And over the last, I would say, a decade, that has become an important instance of disciplining people about what they should eat and what is good to eat, and where there is no sense of limits of questions of privacy. So in some ways, what you eat becomes a loud political public argument rather than staying in the household as something private, a question of privacy, what you eat at your home, should not matter to the state, should not matter to the public, but it has come to matter, and it has become A, terrifying, B, disheartening for someone like me who's born into a Hindu family, and my parents are practicing, believing Hindus, to see this kind of intolerance and violence spread in India, which is linked to forms of religious fundamentalism, with pressure on what people should eat. And this links back to my previous comment, which is about you are what you do not eat in the Indian context.
Yeah, I mean, I have definitely been hearing about a lot of the violence and the Hindu nationalism, but I did not understand this piece about how it's connected to food and how it's connected to meat eating.
Yeah, it's totally astonishingly connected to meat eating.
I had
so in some
no
ways,
idea.
It's not a trivial, what you eat is not a trivial question in India anymore.
I'm speaking with Krishnendu Ray. He's a professor in the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies at New York University. He's the author of The Migrant's Table and The Ethnic Restaurateur. He visited the campus of Indiana University through the DAR India Studies program at the Hamilton Luger School for Global and International Studies. After a short break, we'll theorize about touching food in the digital age. Stay with us. Kate Young here. This is Earth Eats. If you're just joining us, my guest today is Krishnendu Ray, food studies professor at NYU. He published an article about touching food in the journal Anthropology of Consciousness and in Cultural Anthropology for their series Hands On, Touching the Digital Planet. I wanted to hear more about that.
This piece came out in the Anthropology of Consciousness journal, and I forget the exact title. I think it's something like Touching Food. What is it called?
It is Touching Food on Finding the Tactile.
Tactile,
Yeah,
exactly.
very good.
Yes, very clever, right? In fact, I was struggling with the title. I wanted to find a neologism that engaged with this question of tactile, which is touch, but also touch in the digital age. That's what the framing of this piece was. So in fact, it was my doctoral student, Natasha Bernstein-Bunzel, who suggested to me, maybe you should invent a word called tactile, which is TECH-TILE. Anyway, so this piece is about, I would say, let me illustrate it to you. It's about touching. And one of the things that distinguishes Indian food culture is that we eat with our hands. So you are touching the food directly, quite distinct from what happens in Southeast Asia and especially in East Asia. You're going to chopsticks. In Southeast Asia, you're often using spoons. And when you go to the Mediterranean world, think about a map of Asia in your head. Think about the Mediterranean world and European world, you're moving to forks. By the way, that happened relatively recently, 18th and 19th century, that most Europeans moved to using the fork. People would also use their hands. But now that we are used to, and Americans, because so many Americans came from Europe, became a culture of fork usage. So this piece is about food in the Indian Ocean world. And it's India. It's also, I give an example of cooking and touching in Zanzibar because I observed it there, and also cooking and touching, say, on Malaya Peninsula in Penang. So it's all across the Indian Ocean world. I would say what connects Indian food and Indian Ocean food is in fact eating with our hands and not eating with chopsticks and not eating with the fork. So in the first instance, this is about touching food directly. And I would say if my first argument is Indian food is, say, 20,000 food according to dialects, my second argument is if anything that unites Indian food is that we eat it with our hands. Okay, from chapatis, rotis in northern India, to rice and porridge, also with your hands, which is kind of distinctive in some ways, along with dal. It takes a certain kind of a body technique. And so this piece is about, in some ways, that, but it's about, in some ways, what makes Indian food distinctive is the use of hands. What connects it to something bigger than India, which is the Indian Ocean world in some ways. And in this piece, I also talk about, I'll give you a specific example. My mother lives in Delhi with my brother, and I try to call her. She has the toughest time doing the sliding motion in a smartphone because she's always tempted to press. And the press function works very differently than the sliding function that is so crucial. So say when I call up my mom and say, Mom, how did you make that goat meat curry or that eggplant in yogurt sauce? She has a difficult time picking up the phone because she cannot do the sliding motion. Okay? So that is what focused me into this question of Indians are obviously good at touching and manipulating touch because they're doing these subtle movements with their rice, with their dal, with their various kinds of vegetables. But certain movements of the hand is generationally determined. Compared to her, my son is a master of the smartphone move, the sliding touch. He's good at that. But if you ask him to write, okay, he has never written in his life, more or less seriously, handwritten, okay? It's always digital, okay? It's always touch. So if you almost see an infant now with an iPad, the infant almost knows what touch is and what tactility is of a particular kind. So in some ways you can say my son generationally has lost the capacity for calligraphy in some ways, right? Which is very important culturally in different parts of the world, including in India, and writing in Urdu, writing in Devanagari for Hindi script or Bengali Odia, or writing in the East Asian world. And yet, so he's very digital and very proficient at it, very unskilled in writing with the hand, but he constantly works with ceramics. He throws ceramics, he makes ceramics. So he's obviously using touch in a subtle and a complicated way. And he also builds his own computers. So he's not just using the computer, but he's also putting it together, various components. So this made me think about, by gender and by generation, how our different skills of touch and tactility is linked to context, infrastructure. So this is basically an argument about the relationship between infrastructure and culture. Usually when we think about culture, we rarely directly link it to infrastructure. Okay, and bodily habits generationally. There's an anthropologist, Marcel Mauss, who articulated the argument, who in fact articulated for the first time the way a body moves through a material world and a social world is strongly shaped by gender and generation. The way you walk, the way you run, the way you swim. For instance, I know how to swim, but my swimming is a totally ugly swimming rather than the trained swimming most Americans do. If you put me in a swimming pool, I'm an embarrassment. But I can swim to save my life if you throw me in the sea or throw me in a lake, okay? That's body technique. You learn how to do these things. You learn how to walk, and often you can distinguish an American from their style of walking, even if you run into them anywhere else in the world. Okay, compared to Indian, for instance. So this whole piece is about gender, generation, infrastructure, and body technique, and how our sense of touch is changing and being redistributed differently, and what is its relationship to consciousness and what we think, because so much of our bodily activity is in fact unthinking habit. So at the end of it, it's a way to think about habit and conscious activity. And in some ways, my mother's habit of pressing, she cannot retrain her body past the pressing, which comes in the way of sliding, okay? Or take my son's example, in some ways, his amazing digital touch, ceramic touch, he cannot transform that into writing because I was really pissed off when I saw his signature on his passport. I said, what is this thing? Okay? And so my dad would be very disappointed because my dad had this elaborate calligraphic writing, that he took great pride in. His writing was much better than mine. My son's writing is much worse than mine. And that is generationally related to the architecture of in some ways, the infrastructural world that we live in. So this whole piece is about touch and infrastructure.
Well, could we go back just a little bit to the idea of touching food and thinking about your mother and her habit or practice or tradition of eating with her hands, but also I would imagine preparing food with her hands and probably lots of intricate and specific kinds of actions with her fingers and her hands. And maybe none of them include sliding across a very smooth surface. There's probably a sliding motion in something, but not something so slick like a piece of glass.
Excellent point about it.
Yeah.
Like she would do typically, when she cooks, for instance, she would take the sauce out because most Indian food is saucy. She'll take a sauce out and kind of a little bit on a ladle, blow on it and with her right hand and drip it on her left palm and then lick it to taste for salt. Yeah? And all those are this complex relationship between kind of twisting, turning, pouring, touching, licking, which is a very important part of this the technical skill of cooking. And so she does it very well. And she also, in this piece, I talk about another subject, not my mom exactly, but we come from a culture in which I would say over 3 generations, we have moved from a squatting civilization to sitting and standing. So when my mom moved, I'll use my mom here as an example, though I don't use it in the article itself. When my mom moved to my brother's household in Delhi, she basically moved from a squatting place in Balasore, the small town, remember, on coastal India, and to where your cooking is done standing up in some ways, and where in my mom's home, dishwashing and the water was coming at a height of about 3 feet from the ground. Okay, not primarily in a sink, and both my grandmothers, okay, were totally squatting. They never sat at a table. My parents' generation is the generation that moves to a sitting civilization and chairs, dining tables. I remember, my brother remembers exactly the date in which we got our first dining table because this was a sign of urbanism, cosmopolitanism being part of a global urban culture is the dining table and dining chairs. So our lives, my first, 10, 15 years of my life, it was all squatting on the floor, okay? Including, by the way, the toilet is a squatting toilet, which creates a different kinds of strength on your biceps, on your glutes in terms of balance too, okay? And then you move the second generation, my parents' generation, moved to the chair, and then, for instance, cooking, standing and cooking. It used to be squatting and cooking. Both my grandmothers cooked in a chulla, wood fire, coal fire, at the ground level, okay? Dishwashing at the ground level. So then they had to do a lot of sitting and standing and sitting and standing. So their legs were fantastically strong. Okay. And I noticed it because after 6 months of my mother moving from her home into my brother's home, she was much more unstable in terms of squatting and sitting and standing up. Okay. And my sister-in-law pointed it out to me. She says, we have to give her these tools so she squats and stands up. She retains those muscles and the strength. And one of the things we did was there's a knife that is used in Eastern India. It is not a knife with a hand, but it's called a boti. A boti has a wooden base and then an S-shaped knife. And you squat on the floor and you use it to shred vegetables, make a fine dice of cucumbers. It is your body weight against the knife and you're doing it squatting and balancing. So we had to buy one of those things in Delhi so that she could use it so she would not lose her capacity of in some way squatting, standing, that transition and the strengths of some of our muscles, which of course also reminded us body technique, and use of the body. And she's 86 years old. We would like her to be able to sit, stand, squat, and go back and forth. And that is very good for her balance. So anyway, this is an example of the relationship between infrastructure, the built environment, body techniques, skills, and ways of cooking, ways of prepping, and ways of eating. And this article is an attempt to connect those things.
Yeah, just hearing you talking about that is making my knees hurt.
Exactly.
I do not have that strength. And yeah, that's also, in the article, you had described that knife, or you had talked about using it, and I could not picture it. But just now when you explained it,
I can show it to you right now and squat and show. In a sense, you sit and you kind of the wooden base, and you put the weight of the body against it, and
so the knife is stable.
Knife is stable.
Your body
you are
that's
the body.
Moving.
The body is kind of rhythmically moving, and she can do the finest dice of a cucumber with that. It's a very sharp knife. It's a large S-shaped knife, and you use your body and the weight and the balance to do that. And of course, I don't have the technical skill to do it, My son has no technical skill to do that. He's much more proficient with knives standing on a cutting board.
I was going to ask about your son and the eating with his hands. Is that something that...
Not very proficient. He's not very proficient, and he can use his hand a little more for the breads and stuff. But the technique that goes into using, think about rice and dal.
Yeah, those are two that you don't think of eating with your hands.
You don't think of, with your spoon, etc. And I am losing slowly the capacity as I increasingly practice it in an American world where I would increasingly use the fork and the spoon. But he, in some ways, his skill is nowhere near the technical skill my mother has, my brother has, my sister-in-law has, and I have. And in terms of the total changing it's runny, and you make a kind of a mound of the rice, almost like a little ball, and you add the dal to it, and you take it in one motion into your mouth, but not like a mess all over your face, but in a very delicate and a dignified way of eating, and that's body technique. And my son does not have those techniques, though he, even as a little child, he would say, I would want, Dad, can I eat Indian style today? So he would do that. He would try that. But mine was a mixed American and an Indian family. My wife was American. I had two stepchildren who were already, in some ways, socialized in the American world. And remember, it takes us almost a decade to master the fork. So it's a complicated tool. Okay, and it becomes naturalized. Okay, and just as using the hands in a particular way, these were almost two kinds of social infrastructure came into play in my household. One lost and the other won.
Well, I have kept you a little longer than I said, so thank you so much. This has been a really fascinating conversation. I could keep going for another hour, but I know we both need to go. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
I've been speaking with Krishnendu Ray. He's a professor in the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies at New York University. He's the author of The Migrant's Table and The Ethnic Restaurateur, and he's an editor of the food studies journal Gastronomica. He visited the campus of Indiana University through the DAR India Studies program at the Hamilton Luger School for Global and International Studies. We have links to his work on our website, eartheats.org. Next up, fire up your camp stoves. We're making my favorite hot sauce. Welcome back to Earth Eats. I'm Kate Young. The time has come to make the hot sauce. Every year for I don't know how many years, I have been making habanero hot sauce. One of the reasons I love doing this is because the peppers are so easy to grow. The plants are beautiful. Nothing ever seems to bother them. There's never any pests or disease. They do fine with a lot of water or not much water. They're just gorgeous in the garden, especially once the peppers start turning color. I have two varieties this year, orange and red. They're so gorgeous and so productive. I've gotten hundreds of peppers already off these, and there's more coming. I also happen to have a lot of friends who like hot sauce. I get a big kick out of making a huge batch of hot sauce and then bottling it up and giving it away to my friends. The past couple of years, I have learned that it is best to do this outside. I borrowed a camp stove from a friend, and it was so great to not have all the fumes from these habaneros in my kitchen. It really can get very intense. The air is just thick with it. People are crying as they walk through the kitchen. So doing it outside is much better. And today, it is a gorgeous day in early September. It's sunny, breezy, cool. It's like 67 degrees out here. I am on my front porch because I kind of wanted to have the shade of the porch. Got a table set up, got all my stuff. We're gonna make the hot sauce outside on the camp stove. But first, we've got to prepare all of the ingredients. I'm gonna make 8 batches in one pot. My ingredient list is 4 onions, 2 quarts of apple cider vinegar, 8 teaspoons of honey, 40 garlic cloves, 8 carrots, 2 quarts of water, 16 teaspoons of salt, and 96 habaneros. Of course, if you're just making a single batch, you only need 12 peppers. One of the things I love about this recipe is it's really simple. You just combine all of the ingredients into the pot, you bring it to boil and let it simmer till everything softens, and then you blend it, and I always run it through a food mill because I like to get all the seeds and everything out and make a nice smooth sauce. So let's get started. All you have to do with the peppers, you don't have to cut them up or anything. You just take the stems off and drop them in the pot. Next, I'm going to work on the garlic. All I really need to do with the garlic is get them peeled. I need 40 cloves. Because I'm doing a mass amount, I'm going to use that trick where you put the garlic in a metal bowl and you put another metal bowl on top of it and you just slam it around to get this peels off. I've done it before. It works really well. So I'm going to get 40 cloves of garlic into this bowl. I've got all these garlic cloves in one bowl. I'm going to put another bowl on top, and I'm going to shake it like crazy. Worked pretty good. Some of these are fully peeled, and some of them are just, the peel is just so loosened that it just slips right off. It's a really great method for when you need to peel a bunch of garlic. Probably not worth it for just 2 or 3. All right, that's it. The garlic is peeled, and now I can use this bowl to put all the stems and everything in. Carrot peels, onion peels. It's perfect. All right. On to, I think next we're going to work on the carrots. Many people I know would choose not to peel the carrots, but I find that the peels lend a slight bitterness to the sauce, and so I like to go ahead and peel them. All right, so that's 8 carrots. You want to cut the carrots up pretty small because they're going to take the longest to cook. So the smaller they are, the faster they're going to cook, and we want everything in the pot to reach a nice level of softness before we go to blend. So just try to cut them pretty small. They don't need to be pretty or uniform or anything like that. The carrots are going to really lend a lot of body to the sauce and also just a note of sweetness, but they are really going to help with the texture of the sauce, kind of thicken it up. Next, we're going to get the onions chopped up. Same thing with these, just fairly rough chop. Doesn't have to be pretty, doesn't have to be uniform. All going to get blended up into a sauce. All right, we got our 4 onions and our 8 carrots all peeled, chopped up, and into the pot. Now it's just a matter of measuring the rest of the ingredients and cooking the sauce down. So we need 2 quarts of apple cider vinegar and then equal parts water. So 2 quarts of water. I need 2 tablespoons plus 2 teaspoons of honey. All right, we got the honey in there. Only thing left is the salt. Okay, it's going to be 5 tablespoons plus 1 teaspoon of salt. Okay, we are all set on the ingredients. Everything is in the pot. Now just to get it on the heat. So I need to set up the camp stove, and then we're ready to roll. Okay, I got the camp stove all set up. Now it is time to light it and get the hot sauce going. And I have all the ingredients in one big stock pot. And I'm just going to bring it to boil. And then once it comes to a boil, I'm going to turn the heat down a little bit and just let it simmer till all the vegetables are softened, especially the carrots. The carrots, like I said before, they're going to take the longest. So we'll just keep testing those. And once they get soft enough, then we'll be ready to blend it. So the habanero hot sauce has been cooking for about 30 or 40 minutes. Everything is beginning to soften. The carrots are totally done. Not quite sure about the peppers yet, but I think they're getting close. And I am going to go ahead and begin to blend the sauce. All right, so what I'm going to be using to blend this is a stick blender, also sometimes called an emulsion blender. This works really great in a hot pot like this. You can just blend it directly in the pot, no transferring it to anything. So I'm going to go ahead and start that. First, I'm going to turn off the heat though. Hooey! And this is the place where the fumes get really intense. If we were doing this indoors, the kitchen would be on fire right now. Just all of that heat coming from those peppers is just right in your face when you're over this, blending it. Whew, it's really getting to me. All right, it's looking pretty smooth. It's also looking pretty thin, so I'm going to cook it for a little bit longer just to reduce it some before I pass it through the food mill. Okay, we have been cooking this for a little bit, trying to reduce it down some so it's not quite so thin. Oh! Wow. Oh, the steam just hit me. Yeah, that is some pretty serious fumes. Okay, this is why we make the hot sauce outside. This is why I got the camp stove. So now it's time to put it through the food mill. If you don't know what a food mill is, there's a famous kind of classic brand called Foley Food Mill. You might have heard of it with that title. The one I have is not a Foley, but it does the same thing. It's just a device that you can kind of push things through and it will filter out all of the kind of skins and seeds and stuff that you might not want in there. And then just this nice velvety sauce is what's left. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this off and then I'm going to put it all through this food mill and see what we've got. All right, let's go. The way that a food mill works is there's a circular kind of blade or paddle that when you rotate it around with a hand crank, it pushes the food through a sieve. And then at the end, what you're left with is this really nice, smooth sauce. And all of the skins and all of the seeds from the peppers have been filtered out. It's just all really nice and smooth. I'm going to cook it down just a tiny bit more to just get it a little bit less thin, and then we'll be all done and ready to bottle. Unlike most things that I make, tasting hot sauce is not something you can just really do right as you're making it, because hot sauce isn't something that you just eat by the spoonful. I mean, I guess some people do, but I do not. So today I've just got a simple cheese quesadilla and I'm going to try my habanero hot sauce. Shake it up. And for me, a little bit goes a long way. Whew. Okay, yeah, it's very hot. It's very hot. The edges of my tongue are really burning and tingling right now, but it has such a great flavor. I love the fruitiness of the habanero. It's there in the aroma too. It's so delicious. I love it. I do really enjoy this hot sauce. Just a couple of drops on a quesadilla, or a few drops in some eggs, or some other dish that just didn't get quite spicy enough. Enjoy at your own discretion. This piece was produced by Alexis Carvajal. That's it for our show this week. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. The Earth Eats team includes Eobon Binder, Alexis Carvajal, Alex Chambers, Toby Foster, Leo Paz, Daniela Richardson, Samantha Shimenauer, Peyton Whaley, and we partner with Harvest Public Media. Special thanks this week to Krishnendu Ray. Earth Eats is produced and edited by me, Kate Young. Our theme music is composed by Aaron Toby and performed by Aaron and Matt Toby. Additional music on the show comes to us from Universal Production Music. Our executive producer is Eric Bolstridge.